there is a question that has echoed through more than a century of fashion history, whispered in boardrooms and auction houses, and the hushed conversations of those who study wealth and its dissolution. How does a small leather workshop, born in the quiet corners of Florence, when the world was still catching its breath after the First World War, become the name that defines luxury itself? And then, how does that same empire, burnished by decades of craftsmanship and exclusivity, crumble from within, not from the pressure of competitors or the shifting tides of taste, but from the very blood that built it, the family whose ambitions would eventually devour what their hands had created? The answer begins where all great stories of craft begin, in stillness, in the smell of worked leather, in the patient repetition of a single human hand across time. Picture it now, Florence, late afternoon in the year 1921. The light that comes through the high windows of a workshop just off the Via dell'Ariento has turned amber and heavy. It falls across wooden workbenches, worn smooth by decades of use, catching the edges of leather hides in shades of cognac and chestnut. There is no electric hum here, no machinery, only the sound of a single awl in motion, that precise metallic whisper as it pierces through leather again and again, creating the holes through which thread will later pass. Each puncture is deliberate, each one is necessary. The smell is particular, unmistakable: beeswax, saddle soap, the deep, almost mineral scent of tanned hide, that mixture of earth and craftsmanship that no factory floor could ever replicate. It is a smell that carries information to anyone who knows how to read it. It tells of quality, of time taken, of intention. A man moves through this amber light. His name is Guccio Gucci. He is in his middle years now, his hair beginning to grey at the temples, his fingers stained with the evidence of decades of work. His expression is focused but not tense. This is a man who has found, in the doing of a thing, the entire meaning he requires. If you have ever wondered how dynasties begin, not in grand gestures or thunderous declarations, but in the quiet repetition of excellence, in the slow accumulation of reputation built piece by piece, stitch by stitch, then the story you are about to enter is the story of exactly that. And if you are drawn to the far more complicated question of how such things end, how ambition and brilliance can contain within themselves the seeds of their own undoing, then you have found yourself in the right place. If you enjoy narratives that unfold slowly, that take their time with the texture of history and the deeply human dramas that wealth cannot protect us from, I would ask you to subscribe to this channel. We create long-form documentaries designed specifically for the hours before sleep, richly researched journeys through the rise and fall of history's greatest dynasties, the families whose names became legends and whose private battles became the stuff of tragedy. There are many such stories waiting, each one a doorway into the past, each one prepared to ease you gently into the quietness of night. For now, though, remain here in this Florentine workshop. The awl continues its work. The leather receives each puncture with a kind of patient acceptance. And the question that will animate everything that follows begins to form itself, almost inaudibly, in the space between one stitch and the next. What begins in the pursuit of perfection? What blooms from the marriage of skill and vision? Can it ever truly be protected from the corrosions of time and ego and the simple, devastating hungers of human nature? Guccio Gucci had already lived a life before this moment. He had travelled, he had observed, he had allowed what he saw in the world to plant seeds in his mind, seeds that were only now, in this quiet workshop, beginning to take root and grow. To understand how an empire is born, we must first understand the man who dreamed it. And to understand Guccio, we must begin not in Florence at all, but far away, in a city that would teach him everything he needed to know about luxury, about the desires of the wealthy, and about what beauty and craftsmanship might command in the world. The journey that brought him to this workshop, to this moment of amber light and the whisper of an awl through leather, began years earlier. It began with a young man from a modest merchant family, a boy really, watching the world move through the corridors of one of Europe's most storied hotels. And what he learned there, lessons written not in books but in the leather of expensive luggage, in the expectations of guests who knew the value of fine things, would eventually reshape the entire landscape of luxury itself. But we move ahead of ourselves. The evening in Florence is deepening now. The light is almost gone, and in the dimming workshop, there is only the sound of work continuing, the patient construction of something that will outlast its maker, the first quiet thread in a story that will wind through passion and brilliance, through ambition and betrayal, through the complicated human truth that every dynasty contains within itself the instruments of its own transformation. There exists a particular kind of story, one that unfolds not in the flash of a moment, but across generations, in the quiet tension between ambition and belonging, between the dream of building something that will outlast you, and the inevitable human frailties that threaten to pull it all apart. The Gucci story is precisely such a story. It is a story about leather and vision, yes, but far more fundamentally, it is a story about a family. And families, as we know, are where the most complex dramas of human nature play themselves out, often in the gentlest of settings, yet with consequences that ripple across the world. If you find yourself drawn to these kinds of narratives, to the slow unraveling of great dynasties, to the way personal ambition and family loyalty can become twisted vines around one another, to the quiet moments in which decisions were made that would echo through decades, then I invite you to subscribe. What we're creating here is a space for slow, deeply researched journeys through the rise and fall of history's most compelling family empires, each one a complete world unto itself, yet each one teaching us something essential about what it means to build, to inherit, to struggle, and eventually to lose or transform what we thought was ours forever. The stories we tell here are not hurried. They breathe. They linger in the spaces between events, in the psychology of the people who shaped them, in the forgotten names of artisans and workers whose hands built the foundations that visible history stands upon. They are researched with care from primary sources, court documents, letters, memoirs, and the careful reconstruction of moments that occurred in private rooms and whispered conversations. And they are told in a way that honors both the grandeur and the intimacy of these tales, because the most important moments in any dynasty are often the smallest ones. A glance across a table, a decision made in silence, a betrayal whispered in the dark. So as we move deeper now into the story of Gucci, into the Florence of another century, into the mind of a man named Guccio, who saw something in the trunks of wealthy travelers and knew, somehow, that he could build an empire from that single observation, know that what follows is not merely a recitation of facts or dates. It is an attempt to inhabit the emotional truth of these lives, to understand what drove them, what they feared, what they hoped their legacies would become. It is an invitation to slow down with us, to let the narrative carry you where it will, toward understanding not just what happened to the House of Gucci, but why it matters that it happened at all. And now, let us turn our attention backward to the beginning of everything. The story of Gucci, like all the grandest stories, begins not with grand ambitions but with small, practical observations. Guccio Gucci was born in Florence in 1881, a time when the city had already been bleeding its artistic genius into the world for centuries, yet the ordinary people who lived there, the craftspeople, the tradespeople, were often anonymous even to history. His father was a tailor and merchant, a man of some modest standing in the community, but not wealth. The Florence of Guccio's childhood was a city of workshops and narrow streets, where the smell of leather and cloth and dye mingled with wood smoke from countless hearths, and every sound was muffled by centuries of stone and tradition. We know very little with certainty about his childhood. He left few written reflections, and those who might have recorded such details were more interested, as people often are, in the destination than the journey. But we can say that he grew up surrounded by craft. His father moved in circles where quality mattered, where the difference between a well-made seam and a hasty one determined whether a garment lasted 10 years or 2. Whether this instilled in young Guccio a reverence for craftsmanship, or whether he simply absorbed it through proximity, we cannot say. What we do know is that by his late teens he was restless. Florence, for all its beauty and history, offered limited horizons for a boy without significant family capital or connections. The great merchant families had their established paths. For everyone else, there was apprenticeship, inheritance of modest trades, or the broader world beyond. The practical choice, for a young man of ambition and limited means, was to go where the money was. And in the last years of the 19th century, that meant England. London was the heart of the British Empire, that vast commercial machinery that drew the wealth of continents into its ports and banking houses. Young Guccio, probably in his late teens or early 20s, the exact dates are uncertain, which is itself telling, left Florence and travelled to London. The journey itself would have taken days, perhaps over a week, crossing the Channel by steamer, arriving in a city that was surely far grander and far more overwhelming than anything he had known. He found work at the Savoy Hotel, perhaps one of the most prestigious establishments in London, a place where the newly wealthy and the aristocratic classes came to stay, to be seen, to spend money with the kind of careless confidence that comes from having abundance. We might wonder what drew him there, or more likely, what work was available to a young Italian with limited English. He became a lift boy, what Americans would call an elevator operator. It sounds like a humble position, and in many ways it was. But the Savoy was not a humble place, and the lift boy at such an establishment occupied a curious vantage point. He was invisible in the way that working people are invisible to the wealthy, yet he was present in their moments of transition and passage. He saw them arriving with their trunks and cases, saw them departing, stood in close quarters with their luggage, their companions, their mannerisms and expectations. This is where the seed was planted, though Guccio himself may not have recognized it as such in the moment. The wealthy travelers who came to the Savoy, the industrialists, the titled families, the merchants and collectors of art, they arrived with luggage. Not the crude trunks of the masses, but fine pieces, carefully made leather trunks and cases and bags, constructed to protect valuable belongings and to announce the status of their owners through quality and craftsmanship. These were not cheap necessities, they were statements. A traveller carrying fine leather goods was declaring something about themselves before they spoke a word. Think of what that must have conveyed to a young man from Florence, who understood leather and craft, but had never seen it deployed this way, not merely as functional, but as a language of taste and wealth and belonging. What exactly did Guccio observe in those years at the Savoy? He would have noticed the details that most people overlook: the weight and balance of a well-made case, the difference between leather that had been hastily finished and leather that had been burnished and treated with care. The hardware, the hinges, the locks, the way a handle felt in the hand. He would have noticed which pieces seemed to age gracefully, developing a patina that spoke of genuine quality, and which seemed to deteriorate or look shabby despite their initial appearance of elegance. He would have noticed too the economics of it, the prices that wealthy people paid without hesitation, the pride they took in their possessions, the way that a beautiful trunk or bag could become a companion piece, something a traveller grew attached to across multiple journeys. There is a gentle irony in this. The lift boy at the Savoy was receiving an education in luxury and aspiration, and the marriage between craftsmanship and commerce, an education that a merchant's son in Florence, for all his proximity to tradition, could not have received. He was learning not from theory or from family instruction, but from the lived experience of seeing how the wealthy world actually functioned. And what he saw planted in him an idea, though perhaps it took time to fully form, that there was an opportunity somewhere in the space between the craft he understood and the desires of people who had money. How long he stayed in London is not entirely clear from the historical record. It may have been a few years or longer, but at some point, Guccio returned to Florence. Perhaps his savings were adequate, perhaps he was homesick, perhaps he felt ready to attempt something of his own. Perhaps, as often happens, circumstances and timing simply aligned in a way that made it seem like the right moment. He returned to his native city not as a boy seeking work, but as a young man with an idea, formed not in an instant of inspiration, but slowly, through observation and reflection and the quiet certainty that comes from seeing something that others have not yet noticed or have never bothered to look at carefully. He understood his city. He understood the craft traditions of Florence, the networks of skilled workers, the availability of fine leather. He had seen, at the Savoy, what wealthy people wanted and what they were willing to pay for. He had observed the marriage between necessity and luxury, between the practical requirements of travel and the human desire for beauty and status. And he had learned, through lifting and carrying and observing and listening, something that no inheritance could have taught him, that there was money to be made not by imitating what already existed, but by creating something that felt necessary to people who had never quite realized they needed it. The transition from lift boy to tradesman, from observer to creator, is never fully documented in any person's life. But in Guccio's case, it represents one of those pivotal moments where a particular person, with a particular set of experiences and sensibilities, arrives at a particular moment in history with a particular insight. He was not inventing leather goods. They had existed for centuries, but he was about to create something different, not merely functional, but aspirational, a way for people to carry not just their belongings, but their sense of themselves into the world. The train that carried Guccio Gucci back to Florence in the early months of 1921 moved slowly through the Italian countryside, and one might imagine him sitting by the window, watching the landscape unfold in the pale light of winter, turning over in his mind all that he had learned in those years abroad. He was 37 years old. The war had only recently ended, and Europe itself was still learning how to breathe again. But Guccio had made a quiet decision, the kind that shapes the rest of a life without announcing itself loudly. He would not remain a lift operator in London, watching other people's fortunes ascend while he stayed rooted in service. He would build something of his own. Florence in 1921 was a city of artisans and craft traditions that stretched back through centuries, layered like the pigments in an old fresco. The streets carried the smell of workshops, the tanneries along the Arno, the leather workers in their small rooms, the saddlery makers, whose skills had been perfected over generations. Guccio understood, perhaps more keenly than most, that he had returned to a place where quality and technique were not luxuries, but a language, a shared understanding. He took a small space, modest and unpretentious, in the Via dell'Ariento, close to the city's heart, but not ostentatiously so. This was not a grand opening. There was no ceremony. He simply began. The goods that emerged from that first workshop were small: saddlebags, belts, leather straps for luggage, the kinds of items that travelers and equestrian sportsmen needed. These were not original inventions. Saddlery had been made in Florence for centuries, but Guccio brought something to it, a precision learned from watching the wealthy travelers at the Savoy, an understanding of what luxury travelers actually required rather than what tradition dictated they should want. His leather was supple and well tanned. His stitching was even and fine. His designs were restrained, letting the quality of the material speak for itself rather than overwhelming it with ornament. What is interesting, and worth sitting with for a moment, is that Guccio did not immediately set out to create a revolutionary brand. He was not trying to reinvent fashion or declare war on the established houses of Europe. He was simply trying to make beautiful leather goods with precision and care, the way a skilled craftsman does, and to sell them to people who would appreciate that skill. And yet within this quiet ambition lived the seeds of something larger, a way of thinking about craftsmanship and quality that would eventually become recognizable as distinctly, unmistakably, Gucci. The early pieces were often practical. Saddlebags designed to balance weight evenly on horseback, leather straps reinforced at stress points with careful double stitching, buckles and closures that functioned with absolute reliability. But alongside these purely functional pieces, Guccio began to introduce details that suggested a more refined sensibility. He used leather of different weights and textures with intention. He experimented with subtle colorwork, creating tones and shades that would complement rather than compete with the natural grain of the hide. The proportions of his bags grew more considered. Where another craftsman might have made a saddlebag simply large enough to hold what was needed, Guccio made it large enough to hold what was needed, and no more, understanding that restraint itself could be a luxury. By the mid-1920s, word had begun to spread among a particular class of clientele, people who traveled, who rode horses, who understood the difference between good leather and ordinary leather. The reputation was not based on advertising or fashion plates in magazines, but on the quiet acknowledgement that passed between travelers when one person recognized the quality of another's luggage. This was slow growth, the kind that does not show itself in dramatic leaps, but accumulates steadily, like snowfall that covers the landscape imperceptibly until one morning you realize everything has been transformed. Guccio's sons began to appear in the workshop as they grew old enough. There was Aldo, the eldest, born in 1905, observant and already displaying the temperament of someone who saw business not just as craft, but as expansion and sales. There was Vasco, quieter and perhaps more devoted to the actual work of making leather goods well. And there was Rodolfo, the youngest, artistic in his inclinations, who would later pursue acting before circumstances drew him back into the family enterprise. Each of them would eventually touch the business, would leave fingerprints on what it would become, though they did not yet know it, and neither did Guccio as he bent over his leather in the 1920s, shaping beauty from raw material and skill. The workshop itself became gradually larger as demand increased, but it retained something of its original character. Guccio remained closely involved in the actual production, insisting on standards that other manufacturers might have found impractical. He was said to be difficult to work for, meticulous, exacting, a man who did not compromise on the quality of materials or the attention given to each piece. But this very difficulty, this unwillingness to cut corners or substitute inferior leather for the sake of speed or profit, was precisely what created the perception of Gucci as something more than simply another leather goods maker. What might we call the brand identity at this point? It was not yet a unified visual philosophy or a recognizable logo stamped on every item. Rather, it was an approach, a philosophy that lived in the choice of materials and the care of construction. It was the understanding that luxury did not announce itself loudly, but revealed itself gradually to those who knew how to look. It was the belief that a well-made saddlebag or belt could be beautiful precisely because it was made to be used, not merely to be admired. These ideas, embedded quietly in leather and thread, would echo forward through decades and eventually shape the image of the Gucci house on a global stage. The 1930s were settling into a peculiar kind of darkness across Europe, the sort that moves slowly at first, then quickens without warning. In Florence, where Gucci's small workshop hummed with the sound of needles and mallets, The shadows were lengthening in ways that had nothing to do with the time of day. Benito Mussolini's grip was tightening, and with it came something that would test the very foundations of what the Gucci family had begun to build: the systematic choking off of raw materials. The fascist regime had embarked upon what it called autarky, a kind of enforced self-sufficiency that was meant to shield Italy from international economic pressure. But the effect, particularly for craftsmen who depended on imported leather from across Europe and beyond, was something closer to asphyxiation. The leather that had once flowed into Florence from the cattle ranches of Argentina, from the tanneries of Scandinavia, from suppliers across the continent, began to disappear. The borders tightened, the embargoes widened, the price of what little leather remained climbed toward the unreachable. Imagine, for a moment, being a leather worker in those years. Imagine understanding your craft so completely that your hands knew the feel of hide the way a musician knows the weight of their instrument. And then imagine that your most essential material, the very thing upon which your livelihood and your reputation depended, slowly, inexorably becomes scarce. What do? Do you wait? Do you hope? Or do you do what the Gucci craftsman did? You look around at what remains available, and you begin to think differently. It was in this moment of constraint that something unexpected happened. Necessity, as the old saying goes, becomes the mother of invention, and in the workshops of Florence, necessity was becoming a very fertile mother indeed. The craftsmen began to experiment. They turned to materials that were, at least for now, still accessible. Hemp, with its rough, honest texture, jute, with its pale golden tone, canvas, sturdy and utilitarian, materials that, in another time, might have been considered beneath the standards of a leather house. But the Gucci craftsmen were not interested in shame or in clinging to the past. They were interested in survival, and as they worked with these humbler materials, something remarkable began to emerge. They developed a technique, a pattern that would come to define the house for generations, though few would understand its true origin. The canvas was treated with a particular weave, creating what appeared to be a diamond or honeycomb pattern. This was not, it seems important to note, a design born from aesthetic ambition alone, though beauty did emerge from it. This was a pattern born from pragmatism. The woven structure itself became stronger. The pattern created texture that masked wear. It made the cheaper materials look intentional, deliberate, almost noble in their austerity. Was this pattern, this famous diamond print, a direct response to the shortage, or was it something that evolved over time, refined and reinterpreted until it became mythologized as something inevitable and eternal? The historical record here becomes a little softer, a little less certain. But what we do know is that in these years, while the war machinery of Europe was beginning its slow rumble, the Gucci workshop was learning something crucial, that creativity could bloom even when, or perhaps especially when, resources were constrained. The beauty of this period, from a certain distance, is that it forced an honesty upon the craft. Gucci could not hide behind expensive materials. They had to make something genuinely excellent from what they had. They had to understand that a well-made bag from canvas and hemp, if made with attention and care, could speak just as powerfully as one made from the finest leather. Or perhaps it could speak even more powerfully, because it told a story of ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Think for a moment about what this teaches us. In our own time, when the instinct is so often to equate luxury with cost, with the rarest materials, with the most difficult to obtain resources, there is something almost subversive about discovering that one of the world's most coveted design patterns emerged not from abundance, but from its opposite. It emerged from a moment when the craftsmen of Gucci had to prove something not to the wealthy customers they might one day serve, but to themselves. They had to prove that they could create something beautiful under duress. The diamond pattern that emerged from these years would eventually become woven into the identity of the house. It would appear on handbags and shoes, on scarves and wallets. It would be copied and counterfeited. It would become so familiar that most who wore it would have no memory of why it existed at all. But embedded in that pattern was a kind of resilience, a quiet determination that belonged to anonymous craftsmen whose names were never recorded, whose faces were never celebrated, but whose ingenuity echoed forward through decades. The fascist era brought many hardships to Italy, many sorrows that are not suitable for softness or for the gentle pace of nighttime reflection. But within the Gucci workshop, that same era had created an opportunity for transformation. The materials were limited, yes. The world outside was becoming increasingly turbulent, yes. But the hands that stitched and shaped and refined those canvas and hemp creations were learning something that would serve the house long after the shadows had passed. They were learning to make something extraordinary from what was at hand. And so the workshop continued. The diamond pattern emerged. The canvas bags took shape. And though they were born of necessity, born of embargo and scarcity, they were no less beautiful for it. Perhaps they were more beautiful in the way that truly honest things often are, when they are made from need rather than from vanity, from the desire to create rather than the desire to display. The war had left Europe transformed, and with it, the small leather workshop on the Arno River found itself in an unexpected position. The restrictions that had forced Gucci's craftsmen into such ingenious improvisation, the hemp, the canvas, the bamboo, these had paradoxically become the seeds of something lasting, something that would eventually carry the house far beyond the borders of Tuscany. When the borders finally opened and materials began flowing again, there was no rush to abandon these wartime innovations. Instead, something curious happened. The pieces created from necessity had developed a character all their own, a certain rusticity that spoke to a different kind of elegance entirely. The bamboo-handled handbag emerged from this particular moment, born less from a designer's sketch than from the quiet persistence of craftsmen solving problems. Picture it. The leather was becoming available again, yes, but the artisans remembered the bamboo. They had worked with it, shaped it, understood its grain and its resilience. A handle fashioned from bamboo rods, bound together with leather wrapping, suggested something almost Japanese in its restraint, a natural beauty that required no apology. The bag itself was elegant without ostentation, practical without appearing utilitarian. It was, perhaps, the perfect vessel for the post-war era, refined enough for those who had always known refinement, yet grounded in something real, something that spoke of craft rather than mere luxury. What makes this moment particularly tender to consider is that no one quite knew, at first, that they were creating something that would come to define an entire house's identity. The bamboo bag was simply made because the bamboo was there, because someone realized that necessity had taught them something valuable. Women who carried these bags felt it immediately. There was a weight to them that suggested permanence, a construction that implied these pieces would outlast the fashions that surrounded them. In a world still raw from conflict, still learning to believe in permanence again, this resonated deeply. The post-war years stretched through the late 1940s and into the 1950s with a particular kind of patience that seems almost incomprehensible now. The House of Gucci remained primarily a Florentine operation, known to those who sought it out, but far from a household name. The family was still small, still working intimately with each piece that left their workshop. The leather came from suppliers they had long relationships with, suppliers who understood the standards they maintained. And yet, gradually, almost imperceptibly, word began to travel. A woman in Rome, perhaps traveling through Florence, would discover a Gucci leather bag. She would carry it. Her friends would notice. Someone in Milan would make a pilgrimage to the workshop on the Arno. These early clients were not purchasing luxury in the modern sense. They were acquiring objects that had been made by people they might nearly know, under conditions they could almost comprehend. The leather could be smelled, the stitching could be examined. There was no mythology required, because the work itself was the message. This was the golden hour of regional prestige, the moment before global recognition had yet arrived to complicate everything. The workshop still operated almost as it had when Guccio himself was alive, though his influence now existed more in the standards he had set than in his daily presence. The leather workers came in the morning, they cut, they stitched, they finished each piece with attention that reflected not the demand of a corporation, but the pride of craftsmen who understood that their names, whether recorded or forgotten, were bound into every object they created. The transformation from regional workshop to something approaching international recognition happened almost without announcement. It was not the result of any grand marketing campaign. Such a thing would have seemed almost vulgar in those quieter years. Rather, it was the slow accumulation of moments, the ripple that spreads outward when one person carries a beautiful object and someone else notices. A wealthy traveler visits Florence, discovers the workshop, returns home with a leather satchel or a pair of gloves. That traveler moves in circles where such things are observed, discussed, remembered. The bamboo-handled bags seemed to multiply, at least in the memory of those who would later write about them. Whether this was because they were genuinely becoming more popular or because they were simply so distinctive, so memorable in their particular grace, is perhaps a question worth sitting with gently. What matters is that they became the object associated with this transition, the physical embodiment of how necessity and craft and time could transform an artisan's solution into a symbol. The 1950s brought subtle changes to the workshop, expansions that were careful rather than aggressive. New craftsmen were trained in the old methods. New designs were attempted while old standards were maintained. The balance between tradition and growth was, at this moment, still remarkably stable. The family business was not yet being pulled in competing directions by the ambitions of different family members. The profits, while improving, were being reinvested in materials and skill rather than distributed in ways that would create the later tensions. There is something almost melancholic about studying this period, knowing what would come after. This was the moment before the complexity arrived, before the demands of global markets would begin to challenge the premises upon which Guccio Gucci had founded his house. The leather workshop on the Arno was still, in many ways, a place where the philosophy of the founder was being enacted daily through the hands of craftsmen. It was still possible to maintain the fiction, and it was always somewhat a fiction, that excellence itself was the only ambition that mattered. Yet even in those quiet, patient years, the seeds of transformation were germinating. Success itself was a kind of pressure. As more people wanted Gucci leather goods, the question inevitably arose, how could the workshop meet that demand without compromising the very qualities that had made the demand exist in the first place? This tension, between the desire to remain small and the reality of becoming larger, would eventually tear the family apart. But in the years immediately after the war, in those opening chapters of the house's international story, the conflict had not yet surfaced. There was simply the work, the leather, the bamboo handles, and the slow, almost invisible process of becoming something larger than anyone, at that moment, quite anticipated. The leather workshop that Guccio had built with such patience and care would not remain his alone for long, and perhaps this was always the nature of family businesses. The moment they began to thrive, they began to change. By the late 1920s, as the small Florence shop found its rhythm and reputation among the city's more discerning travelers, Guccio's 3 sons were coming of age, each one carrying a different piece of their father's nature and a different vision for what the House of Gucci might become. Aldo, the eldest, was born restless. Where his father had been methodical, almost meditative in his approach to leather and craft, Aldo burned with an energy that seemed almost electric to those around him. He watched customers, he listened to their wishes, and he began to understand something that would define his entire approach to business. That luxury was not just about the object itself, but about the feeling of possession, the sense of belonging to something rare and coveted. Aldo had inherited his father's hands, capable and precise, but he had also inherited something else, an intuition for commerce, a natural gift for sensing what people wanted before they themselves knew they wanted it. By the early 1930s, he was already making suggestions in the workshop, proposing small changes to designs, encouraging his father to experiment with color and material in ways that went slightly beyond Guccio's more conservative tastes. Vasco, the middle son, remains the quietest figure in the early history of the dynasty, and there is something poignant in that silence. He was a craftsman through and through, a man who found his greatest satisfaction in the technical perfection of a bag, the exact tension of a stitch, the subtle grain of aged leather. Vasco asked fewer questions about expansion or sales or the world beyond Florence. He asked instead about processes, about improving techniques, about training younger artisans in the methods that had been passed down through generations. He was the keeper of the craft itself, the guardian of standards, and while his contributions would be essential to Gucci's reputation for quality, history would remember him far less vividly than his brothers, overshadowed by their grander ambitions. And then there was Rodolfo, the youngest, born when Guccio was already well into middle age, and perhaps because of this, treated with a particular kind of tenderness by his father. Rodolfo possessed a quality that might be described as refined sensibility. He moved through the world with a graceful precision, had impeccable taste, and understood instinctively the aesthetics of beauty in a way that seemed almost innate. While Aldo was learning to sell and Vasco was perfecting his craft, Rodolfo was developing an eye, a capacity to recognize what elevated a design from merely functional to genuinely elegant. He had less interest in the day-to-day operations of the workshop than his brothers, and more interest in the finished object as a statement, as an expression of something almost artistic. These three temperaments, Aldo's commercial hunger, Vasco's devotion to craft, and Rodolfo's aesthetic refinement, might have been complementary. In a family business operating under different circumstances, under a patriarch with perhaps more explicit authority or clearer intentions about succession, these three different sensibilities might have woven together into something whole and coherent. But Guccio Gucci was not a man inclined to spell out such things. He was of an older generation, one that assumed the natural order would simply continue, that sons would work alongside fathers, that wisdom and leadership would flow downward almost by osmosis. He did not hold family meetings to discuss the future. He did not write a will that specified clearly how power would be divided. And so, as the 1930s progressed, and as the House of Gucci began its slow climb toward greater recognition and profit, the three brothers found themselves increasingly working in parallel rather than in harmony, each one developing his own ideas about what Gucci should be. The tensions that would eventually tear the family apart were not, at this stage, dramatic or visible to the outside world. They were the kind of tensions that accumulate quietly, like dust settling on a shelf, small disagreements about which products to prioritize, subtle competitions over who had Guccio's ear, quiet resentments when one brother's suggestion was praised while another's was overlooked. Aldo began to develop his own network of contacts, traveling beyond Florence, cultivating relationships with wealthy clients, thinking always about how the brand might reach further into the world. Rodolfo, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly involved in the aesthetic direction of the company, insisting on certain standards of design and presentation that sometimes conflicted with Aldo's push for volume and accessibility. Vasco, observing these tensions with the mild concern of someone who preferred harmony, tried to keep the peace, but his quiet nature meant that he was often unheard, a voice of reason speaking softly while louder voices competed for attention. There was also, beneath all of this, a question that was never quite asked aloud but was always present. What would happen to the business when Guccio was gone? Who would lead? How would the inheritance be divided? In a family business, these questions are never merely financial or structural. They are deeply personal, touching on love and fairness, and the fundamental question of who is most valued by the patriarch. And in the Gucci family, as in so many families, different sons received different signals about their importance, their prospects, their place in the hierarchy that would come after. The 1930s and 1940s were years of external success for the House of Gucci, years when the brand name began to mean something beyond Florence, when wealthy travelers and fashionable Romans, and eventually international clientele, began to recognize the Gucci name as a marker of quality and taste. But internally, beneath the polished leather and the growing reputation, the seeds of future conflict had already been planted. The three brothers continued to work together, but they were no longer simply three brothers united in a common purpose. They were three men with different visions, different temperaments, different relationships to their aging father, and an increasing sense that the future of the company would belong to some of them more than to others. The harmony of the early years, the sense of a family united in a shared mission, was giving way to something more complex and troubling. The first quiet stirrings of ambition that would eventually become rivalry, of loyalty that would be tested and fractured, of the slow, inevitable process by which success itself can become the thing that tears a family apart. The workshops of Florence had given Guccio Gucci's sons something their father had earned through patience and persistence, a foundation. But patience, it would seem, was not a quality equally distributed among his three sons. Aldo, the eldest, possessed a restlessness that seemed almost at odds with the contemplative craft of leatherworking. Where his father had been content to perfect a single stitch, a single buckle, Aldo found himself drawn to something far larger, the architecture of empire itself. In the years following the war, as Europe began its slow, careful healing, Aldo Gucci moved through the family business with an energy that was almost palpable. He had inherited not only his father's eye for quality, but something altogether different, an instinct for desire. He understood, in a way that seemed almost intuitive, that luxury was not merely about the fineness of materials or the precision of craft. It was about narrative. It was about the story that a well-made object could tell about the person who carried it. It was, perhaps, about dreams. Where Guccio had been a maker, Aldo was becoming a salesman, and in the world that was emerging in the 1950s, a world of renewed prosperity, of American influence, of a hunger for beauty and elegance after years of deprivation, a salesman with vision could reshape the world. The Florence workshop had served its purpose. It had created a name, modest but respected. But Aldo saw something further. Rome, he decided, would be the stage for the next movement. Rome, the eternal city, seat of power and taste. In 1953, the same year his father Guccio passed away, Aldo opened the Gucci boutique on the Via Condotti, one of Rome's most celebrated shopping streets. It was a calculated choice. The street had already become a destination for those with discerning taste, a place where quality was not merely expected, but demanded. The Rome boutique was not large. It was, in fact, quite modest by comparison to what would come later. But it was precious. The shopfront itself spoke of restraint and confidence, an understated elegance that suggested, without ever needing to proclaim, that what lay within was worth seeking out. The leatherwork that had been perfected in Florence now had a stage worthy of it. The small leather goods, the belts, the wallets, the saddlery-influenced designs that had been born from necessity and craft, these were no longer the products of a regional workshop. They were becoming the products of a brand with ambition. Do you ever wonder what it is that transforms a product into a symbol? it is rarely a single moment. Rather, it is accumulation of choices. The choice to open in a particular place, the choice to maintain a standard of quality even as demand grows, the choice to understand who desires your work and why. Aldo seemed to possess an almost uncanny sense of this. He understood that the Americans who came to Rome in increasing numbers, businessmen, actresses, diplomats, the wives of industrial magnates, they were not simply looking for a well-made bag or a leather belt. They were looking for authentication. They were looking for something that whispered of sophistication, of old-world craftsmanship, of a connection to something larger than themselves. The timing of the Rome boutique's opening was perhaps more significant than Aldo could have known at the moment. He was stepping into a particular historical moment, one in which American wealth was ascending, in which Europe, despite its physical devastation, was becoming romantically attractive once more to American eyes. The war had ended, the Marshall Plan had begun its work of reconstruction, and a new generation of Americans were discovering Europe not as soldiers, but as visitors, as seekers, as consumers with money to spend. What better symbol of their newfound sophistication than Italian craftsmanship, Roman elegance, Florentine tradition? But there was something else too. In opening in Rome, rather than continuing to expand in Florence, Aldo was making a subtle declaration. He was saying that Gucci was no longer a Florentine artifact, something precious but provincial. Gucci was, or could become, something cosmopolitan, something capable of appealing not to the local nobility or the regional merchant class, but to the world. The boutique on Via Condotti was not, in those early years, crowded. Luxury of this sort never is. But it began to attract a particular kind of customer, someone who knew something of quality, who understood the difference between surface elegance and true craftsmanship. Slowly, the word spread. Not through advertising in any modern sense, Aldo was far too sophisticated for that, but through the most powerful form of marketing that existed then and exists now, the quiet recommendation of someone whose taste is trusted. It is worth pausing here to consider what Aldo Gucci was doing, because it is not something that can be rushed or easily replicated. He was creating an aura. He was taking the technical excellence of his father's workshop and wrapping it in something more intangible, a sense of belonging to an elite world. To carry a Gucci bag, to wear a Gucci belt, was to signal not merely that one had money, but that one possessed a certain kind of knowledge, a certain kind of sensibility. It was to say, I understand quality, I understand tradition, I understand the difference between what is good and what is merely expensive. The 1950s were years of careful expansion. The Rome boutique remained relatively small, though its influence was disproportionately large. Aldo began to think beyond Italy. Milan received a boutique. Then, almost inevitably, the attention turned northward, across the Alps, to the places where the real wealth of post-war Europe was concentrating. Paris was considered. London was considered. But the real prize, everyone knew, lay across the Atlantic. America in the 1950s was a different world entirely. It was a world of unimaginable wealth, of optimism, of a hunger for European sophistication that had been suppressed during the war and was now bursting forth in full flower. To Americans of that era, Europe represented everything their own country, for all its power and abundance, did not. History, culture, tradition, a kind of effortless refinement that could not be purchased, only absorbed through proximity and association. It was into this hunger that Aldo Gucci stepped with remarkable presence of mind. He understood that Americans did not simply want Italian products, they wanted an Italian experience. They wanted to feel, when they carried a Gucci bag or wore a Gucci loafer, that they were connected to something ancient and noble. And so his vision for Gucci was not merely to make beautiful things. It was to create a world, a complete aesthetic, a philosophy even, that Americans of a certain class would desire to inhabit. The 1950s were, in essence, Aldo Gucci's great seduction. He was not shouting about quality or tradition, he was simply making them available to those with the taste to recognize them. And slowly, quietly, the fashion capitals of the world began to hear the Gucci name, not as a scandal, not as a sensation, but as something inevitable. Something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. On the morning of January 23, 1953, Guccio Gucci died quietly in Florence, leaving behind not merely a business, but a question that would haunt his family for decades to come. He was 81 years old. The man who had begun his life as a lift boy in London, watching wealth ascend and descend in a hotel cage, had built something far more enduring than a company. He had built a mystique, and in the precise moment of his passing, that mystique began to fracture in ways even he might not have anticipated. The will, when read in the austere offices of his lawyers, revealed an inheritance divided among 3 sons. Aldo, the eldest, fierce and ambitious, walked away with a substantial portion. Vasco, quieter and less inclined toward the theatrical side of commerce, received his share. And Rodolfo, who had pursued an interest in cinema before returning to the family fold, found himself positioned as something between heir apparent and creative conscience. It seemed, on its surface, an orderly transition, 3 men, 3 parts of a whole. But orderliness, as anyone who has witnessed the slow unraveling of a family knows, is sometimes merely the pause before the storm. What made this division particularly fraught was not simply the matter of money or shareholding percentages, though those things certainly mattered. It was the absence of a clear hierarchy. Guccio, in his lifetime, had embodied authority through sheer force of personality and the respect his longevity commanded. He had been the wellspring from which all decisions flowed. With him gone, that authority had to be redistributed among men whose temperaments, ambitions, and visions for the company could scarcely have been more different. They shared a name, shared bloodlines, shared a love for fine leather and craftsmanship, and shared almost nothing else of consequence. Aldo, if we must paint a portrait, was the salesman. He possessed an intuitive understanding of how to move product, how to charm a buyer, how to sense the precise moment when desire could be transformed into transaction. He had already proven himself during the post-war years, traveling to Rome and establishing the boutique there while his father was still alive, seeing in his mind's eye a Gucci that could span continents. He was the one who believed the brand could become something far grander than a Florentine workshop, no matter how finely appointed. Vasco preferred the shadows of production. He understood the craft with the devotion of a man who had grown up breathing the smell of leather and linseed oil, who could judge a hide by touch alone, who took immense satisfaction in the solving of technical problems. He was less interested in marketing than in mastery, less drawn to the drama of commerce than to the quiet perfection of a well-made object. Rodolfo occupied a stranger territory still. He had been partially absent from the business in his youth, drawn as he was to the glamour and narrative possibilities of film. When he eventually rejoined the family concern, he brought with him a different sensibility, an appreciation for aesthetics, for the theatrical presentation of luxury, for Gucci not merely as a maker of goods, but as a creator of desire and aspiration. These 3 men now owned the company jointly. They sat on the same board. They answered to no one but each other, and increasingly to the market. And almost immediately, the question began to emerge, hanging unspoken in Florence, like humidity before a storm. Who was in charge? In the immediate years following Guccio's death, the question remained largely dormant, masked by the reality that business was good. The 1950s were dawning. Europe was recovering. America was booming. Travelers were moving again, and travelers had always been Gucci's most devoted customers. The company expanded. New boutiques opened in new cities. The products that Guccio had imagined, the leather goods, the small accessories, the riding equipment, began to take on a new glamour, a new possibility. But beneath the surface of prosperity, the tensions were already organizing themselves. Aldo's expansionist vision was pushing harder and faster. He wanted Gucci everywhere. He understood, perhaps before his brothers fully did, that the modern world did not reward regional excellence the way it once had. Excellence, to survive, had to become luxury, and luxury, to become luxury, had to be desired by people who could afford to pay handsomely for the idea of it, not merely for the object itself. Vasco watched this expansion with growing unease. Each new boutique, each new license granted to a manufacturer to produce goods under the Gucci name, each compromise made in the name of speed or volume, these felt to him like dilutions of something precious. He had inherited a craftsman's morality, a belief that quality could not be hurried or delegated to those without the proper reverence for materials and technique. Rodolfo, meanwhile, occupied an increasingly complex position. He had sons of his own now. One of them, named Maurizio, was young and bright and uncertain about his place in the world. Rodolfo was simultaneously building his own wealth while watching his oldest brother consolidate power through sheer force of personality and business acumen. What happens in such situations, and this is perhaps one of the quiet tragedies that attends upon family businesses everywhere, is that the business itself becomes a kind of battleground for deeper conflicts that have nothing directly to do with profit margins or market share. It becomes a theatre in which older resentments can be performed, in which questions of respect and worth and recognition can be played out in the language of contracts and percentages and board votes. The death of Guccio Gucci in 1953 was not, in other words, merely the passing of a man, though it was certainly that. It was the moment at which the House of Gucci began its long and complicated transformation from a family enterprise into something far more contested and strange. The foundation remained solid. The craftsmen were still there, still capable of extraordinary work. The name still carried weight and prestige. But the invisible architecture that had held the family together, the respect for a single unchallenged authority, had crumbled away. In its place would grow, over the next 3 decades, an increasingly bitter struggle for control, a struggle that would consume fortunes, damage reputations, and ultimately transform the meaning of what it meant to own and operate one of the world's most celebrated brands. The 3 sons would continue to work together, at least for a time. They would make decisions by committee, by negotiation, by the careful calibration of power that only comes possible when no single voice can absolutely dominate. But we might wonder, as we drift deeper into the quiet of evening, whether such an arrangement was ever truly sustainable. When 3 men share one inheritance, when each has his own vision and his own pride, when the business they share is growing larger and more complex with each passing season, can harmony ever truly hold? The 1960s arrived like a curtain rising on a stage that Gucci had been quietly preparing for decades. In this era of rapid transformation, when the world seemed suddenly hungry for beauty and elegance, the House of Gucci found itself positioned at precisely the moment when old-world craftsmanship met modern desire. The family had survived the post-war years, had navigated the scarcities and the innovations born from necessity. Now, in this new decade, something remarkable began to happen. Gucci was no longer simply a respected Florentine leather house. It was becoming a symbol, a whispered name in the circles where influence and discretion walked hand in hand. Picture, if you will, the particular geography of American high society in the early 1960s. There existed a certain world, exclusive, old money, carefully guarded, where the right handbag or the right pair of shoes carried meaning that went far beyond mere fashion. It was not about loud logos or flamboyant display. Those who truly belonged to this world understood that genuine wealth announced itself quietly, almost reluctantly, through the quality of materials and the subtlety of design. And it was precisely this sensibility that drew Hollywood's golden age toward Gucci's leather goods. The story of how Gucci conquered the American imagination is partly one of chance, partly one of Aldo's relentless ambition, and partly one of a single iconic figure whose taste happened to align perfectly with what Gucci represented. That figure was Jacqueline Lee Bouvier Kennedy. By 1961, when her husband took office as President of the United States, Jackie Kennedy had already begun to establish herself as something more than a first lady. She was emerging as a tastemaker, an arbiter of style, a woman whose choices in clothing and accessories would be studied, analyzed, and ultimately imitated by women across America and far beyond. The handbag that became known as the Jackie O bag, though it would not carry that name during her time in the White House, was born from a simple human need. Kennedy required a bag that could hold what a woman of her station required, while remaining elegant, understated, and suitable for the formal and semi-formal occasions that defined her daily existence. Gucci offered precisely that, a structured leather bag with a bamboo handle, refined in its proportions, luxurious in its materials, yet somehow possessing a quality of restraint that matched Kennedy's own aesthetic philosophy. The bag featured a subtle bamboo toggle closure, a detail borrowed from traditional Japanese design, which spoke to Gucci's willingness to incorporate influences from across the world while maintaining a recognizably Florentine sensibility. What happened next was perhaps inevitable, yet its consequences rippled outward in ways that even Aldo Gucci could not have entirely predicted. When photographs appeared in newspapers and magazines showing the president's wife carrying a Gucci bag, something shifted in the collective consciousness of American women. This was not endorsement in any modern sense. Kennedy would never have signed an advertisement or explicitly championed a brand. Rather, it was something more powerful, the visible confirmation that Gucci represented the taste of those at the very pinnacle of American society. And if the president's wife carried a Gucci bag, then perhaps, the reasoning went, one should as well. The effect was almost immediate. Gucci boutiques in New York and other major American cities found themselves suddenly popular with women who had never given much thought to Italian leather goods before. The bag became sought after not because it was flashy or trendy, but precisely because it signaled that one understood a certain code of elegance. Wearing Gucci in the 1960s conveyed a quiet message. I have refined taste. I value quality over ostentation. I belong to a world where such things matter. It was, in essence, a form of social currency transmitted through leather and bamboo. But the Jackie O phenomenon, though significant, was only one thread in the larger tapestry of Gucci's rise to international prominence during this glittering decade. Across Hollywood, among actors and actresses and directors and producers, Gucci was becoming the house of choice for those who wished to appear sophisticated and worldly. The film industry, with its constant appetite for glamour and its need to signal status both on screen and off, became a powerful vector for Gucci's expansion into American consciousness. Actresses wore Gucci shoes to premieres. Directors carried Gucci leather briefcases. There emerged, unspoken but understood, a sense that Gucci was what people of genuine culture possessed. Perhaps most enduring among Gucci's creations from this era was the loafer bearing the horsebit buckle, a piece of hardware that seemed almost humble in its origins, yet would become one of the most recognizable symbols of the brand. The horsebit, derived from actual equestrian equipment, was positioned across the front of a simple leather loafer, a gesture toward the brand's historical roots in saddlery and leatherworking. Yet in the hands of Gucci's designers and craftspeople, it became something more. A calling card, a marker of identity, a small but unmistakable signal of membership in a particular world. What made this loafer so powerful in its cultural moment was that it managed to embody multiple seemingly contradictory qualities simultaneously. It was practical enough to wear in everyday situations, yet distinctive enough to signal taste and awareness. It was comfortable and approachable, lacking the rigid formality of some Italian shoes, yet possessed an unmistakable air of luxury. A man could wear the Gucci loafer with confidence to a casual lunch or to a more formal business meeting. The shoe did not demand attention or admiration. Rather, it quietly announced that the wearer understood certain things: the value of quality, the importance of heritage, the pleasure of well-made objects. During this golden age, there existed what might be called a mythology of Gucci in the American imagination. The brand represented not merely luxury, but a particular kind of luxury, the kind associated with Italy, with Renaissance craftsmanship, with families of artisans who had passed down skills across generations. When an American woman purchased a Gucci bag, or an American man selected a pair of Gucci loafers, he or she was participating in a fantasy, yes, but also in something genuinely rooted in history and tradition. The fantasy was not that one was Italian, but rather that one had developed the taste and discernment to appreciate what Italian craftsmanship represented. The designers and craftspeople who created these objects during the 60s worked largely in obscurity. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers or magazines. Yet they understood, in the way that skilled artisans understand, that they were creating objects that would outlast fashion, that would develop patina and character with use, that would be passed from mothers to daughters or from fathers to sons. The leather aged with grace, the stitching held. The hardware, though simple, possessed a durability born from the selection of proper materials and the application of proper techniques. What is worth noting, as we linger in this golden age for a moment longer, is that Gucci's success during the 1960s was built not on innovation or revolution, but on a kind of perfection of what had already been established. The bamboo-handled bag, the horsebit loafer, the leather goods that still bore traces of their humble post-war origins. These were not radical departures. Rather, they were refinements. They were the result of understanding precisely what certain people wanted and providing it with unwavering consistency and quality. In an age of rapid change and constant novelty, Gucci offered something almost countercultural: the promise of continuity, of tradition adapted to modern life, of objects that would not feel dated next season or the season after. Hollywood's infatuation with Gucci spoke, in many ways, to something deeper in the American consciousness during this era. The 1960s were a time of enormous change, of social upheaval, of questions being raised about the nature of American society itself. Yet alongside this ferment of change, there remained a hunger for connection to tradition, to history, to the idea that some things were fundamentally good and right and true. Gucci, in its way, provided such reassurance. It was not American, yet it had become thoroughly integrated into American life. It was rooted in the past, in centuries of Florentine craftsmanship, yet it spoke fluently to contemporary desires and aesthetics. By the mid-1960s, Gucci had become almost inescapable in certain circles. And yet, and here we must note something that is crucial to understanding the company's trajectory, the expansion and the fame had not fundamentally altered the family dynamics that would eventually tear the House of Gucci apart from within. Aldo continued to expand, to dream of a global empire, his ambitions seemingly boundless. Rodolfo remained more conservative, more protective of the brand's prestige, more skeptical of some of his brother's more aggressive expansion plans, and in the background, the younger generation was watching, learning, developing their own visions and their own resentments about who should lead the family into the future. The Golden Age, in other words, was not a simple story of success and harmony. It was rather the brightest moment before shadows began to lengthen, before the question of succession and control became impossible to ignore. And perhaps it is worth pausing here, in the midst of all this expansion and ambition, to step away from the boardrooms and the boutiques, and to descend instead into the workshops themselves, where the actual hands that built this dynasty remained largely invisible to the world that wore their creations. The making of Gucci leather was never a quick process, nor was it ever meant to be. To understand the true foundation of the brand, one must understand the extraordinary patience required in the transformation of hide into luxury. When a hide arrives at the tannery, it is a raw animal skin, salt-crusted and stiffened, utterly unpromising. The first step, called liming, requires the skin to be soaked in a solution of lime and water, sometimes for weeks, the leather slowly softening as the lime breaks down the bonds between hair and hide. The smell during this stage is acrid and ancient, the smell of change itself. Workers would move through these vats with a rhythm developed over decades, knowing by touch alone when the leather had reached precisely the right state of readiness. Then came the removal of the hair itself. A laborer would scrape away at the skin with a curved blade, not carelessly, but with a kind of meditative attention, each stroke removing hair and outer epidermis without puncturing the precious dermis beneath. This work was monotonous, yes, but monotony and mastery are often the same thing. The hands that performed these tasks for 40 years, 50 years, knew no difference between boredom and meditation. What followed was equally deliberate. The tanning itself, whether vegetable tanning or chrome tanning, was a chemistry lesson written in time. Vegetable tanning, the traditional method that Italian craftsmen favored, involved soaking hides in solutions made from oak bark and mimosa extract, moving the leather from one vat to the next in a processional that could take months. Each bath deepened the leather's capacity to hold color, to develop a patina, to age with dignity rather than merely to deteriorate. There was no rushing this. A master tanner knew that to accelerate the process was to betray the material itself. The chrome tanning, faster and more practical for a growing business, was a compromise. It offered consistency, speed, a kind of democratic access to quality that vegetable tanning could never provide. Yet something essential was lost in the acceleration. Chrome-tanned leather would never weather with quite the same grace, would never develop the warm bronze and amber hues of vegetable-tanned hide that had spent months in the bark solutions. The Gucci family understood this distinction. They used both methods, depending on the piece, the customer, the intended lifetime of the object. Once the leather was tanned and dried, it moved to the dyers, and here another layer of craft was revealed. The dyes used in the 1920s and 1930s were considerably less sophisticated than those available today, and this limitation paradoxically forced a greater skill upon the dyer. To achieve a true, rich red or a deep forest green required knowledge that lived in the hands, not in the instructions. A dyer would test the leather constantly as it absorbed color, drawing it from the dye bath at intervals, feeling its weight change, noting how light moved across its surface. They were reading the leather-like text. And then, finally, came the workers whose contribution to Gucci's legend is almost entirely forgotten. The cutters, the stitchers, the finishers. The cutting of a pattern from a sheet of leather seems simple, and this simplicity is precisely what makes it demanding. A master cutter could look at a hide and see its grain, its subtle variations, and choose to cut each piece not merely efficiently, but in alignment with the leather's own structure. They understood that leather, like all living materials that have been transformed, still possesses a kind of memory, a preferred direction. To cut against this grain was to ensure a bag that would eventually warp, that would age poorly. The stitching itself was performed largely by hand, at least during the decades we are describing. A seamstress would sit at a bench with needles and waxed thread, the leather held in her lap or on a cushioned form, and she would push the needle through predetermined holes with an even, measured rhythm. The stitch that held a Gucci bag together was not merely functional, it was a statement about time and attention. In an era when mass production was already rendering handwork economically obsolete, Gucci's insistence on hand-stitching was an act of resistance, though perhaps the family did not think of it in those terms. It was simply how things should be done. Consider for a moment what precision this required. The holes through which the needle passes had to be made at exactly the right depth, the right distance from the edge, the right distance from one another. If they were too shallow, the stitch would tear free when the bag was lifted with weight in it. If they were too deep, the needle would puncture through to the front of the leather, creating tiny flaws that would catch the eye of any buyer who knew what they were looking for, and many of them did. Gucci's clients were people accustomed to luxury, to precision, to materials that revealed themselves as exceptional only through a kind of intimate familiarity. The finishers, who came last in the process, had the task of burnishing the edges, of applying final treatments that would protect the leather from moisture and handling, of ensuring that every visible surface was absolutely correct. An edge that was not properly burnished would fray, would darken unevenly, would look hastily made. A properly finished edge had a subtle luster, a smoothness that suggested care and completion. How many people, do you suppose, handled a single Gucci bag during its creation? At least a dozen, perhaps 20. How many of their names survive in any record? Almost none. They signed no documents, received no acknowledgement beyond their wages, and when photographs were taken to celebrate Gucci's success in glossy magazines, the faces visible were those of the family owners, the businessmen, the designers who received the credit, the people whose hands actually transformed hide into the objects of desire, were present only as an absence, a kind of invisible labor upon which all the visibility of the brand depended. And yet, in a curious way, they remain present. Every seam in a vintage Gucci bag, every burnished edge, every perfectly placed stitch tells the story of someone's attention, someone's skill, someone's decision to do the work correctly rather than merely adequately. The leather itself, aged now to a soft patina after decades of use, speaks the language of those forgotten hands. In this sense, the nameless workers of Florence's leather workshops achieved a kind of immortality. They will never be known, but their work will outlast by far the fame of those who signed their names to it. By the early 1950s, Aldo Gucci had begun to see something that his brothers and cousins could not yet fully grasp. While the workshops in Florence continued their methodical work, while the leather was still being hand-treated in vats of ancient recipes, Aldo was watching the world itself transform. The post-war years had opened new routes of commerce, new ships carrying goods across oceans that had only recently been crossed by warships. Airports were beginning to dot the landscape where there had only been train stations before, and in New York in particular, Aldo sensed an appetite, a hunger, even for European sophistication that seemed almost inexhaustible. The Rome boutique had been merely a beginning, a testing of the waters, a small proof that people in Italy's capital would pay for the Gucci name. But Aldo understood, in a way that seemed almost intuitive, that the true market lay beyond the Mediterranean. The Americans, in particular, were discovering Europe again after the war. They had money. They had a kind of hunger for elegance that was almost touching in its earnestness. They wanted to own something that meant cultivated taste, that whispered of Florentine artisans and Renaissance lineage, that suggested you were not merely wealthy but refined. So in 1952, Aldo opened the first Gucci store on Fifth Avenue in New York, not in a modest location, but in one of the most coveted retail spaces on the continent. The store itself became a kind of statement. High ceilings, carefully appointed, every detail chosen to communicate an almost austere elegance. This was not a shop where one hastily purchased goods. This was a temple to taste, and the prices reflected it. A leather handbag cost what a working person might earn in several weeks, and yet they sold. They sold with a steadiness that astonished even Aldo, though he would never have admitted astonishment to anyone. The success in New York opened doors that had seemed closed only years before. If America wanted Gucci, then perhaps the world did too. Tokyo came next, where post-war Japanese society was itself undergoing a transformation, and a new professional class was eager to signal their arrival into modernity with tokens of Western luxury. Then London again, but this time not as the city where Aldo had worked as a boy, but as a proper capital of commerce and fashion. Zurich, Paris. The stores began to appear like chapters in a story that was still being written, each one a small embassy of the Florentine name. But here, in the midst of this expansion, something quietly began to shift within the family itself. The business that had once been a shared endeavor, however uneasily shared, was increasingly becoming Aldo's vision, and his alone. Where once the brothers had consulted, now decisions were made. Where once profits had been divided, now they were being reinvested in new ventures that not everyone understood or agreed with. Rodolfo, who had remained more connected to the original artisanal mission of the company, watched this expansion with a kind of wary concern. The brand was growing, yes, but was it growing in the right direction? Were they opening windows into the Gucci soul, or were they simply opening more windows to sell more goods? Vasco, the third brother, had largely withdrawn from the active business, content to receive his dividends and leave the broader decisions to his more ambitious siblings. But Rodolfo remained present enough to notice that ambition was beginning to calcify into something harder. Aldo's vision for a global empire was not wrong, precisely. It was, in fact, increasingly vindicated by the numbers, by the waiting lists for certain items, by the reporters who came calling with notebooks and cameras. But in pursuing this vision, Aldo was quietly beginning to reshape the company in ways that moved it further from its roots. The expansion required capital, which meant borrowing. It required delegation, which meant hiring people who did not grow up in leather shops, who did not understand the family's original creed, who saw the business as merely business. And as the empire grew, it also became more difficult to govern as a true family enterprise. Decisions that once might have been made over wine at a dinner table in Florence now required memos, meetings, increasingly formal structures. The personal trust that had once bound the brothers together was being slowly replaced by corporate hierarchy, by contracts and formal agreements that seemed almost to anticipate conflict rather than to prevent it. Aldo's son Paolo was coming of age during this period of expansion, and he too was beginning to have ideas about design, about innovation, about how Gucci might evolve beyond the leather goods and saddlery influences that still dominated the collections. He saw the world differently than his father did, and this difference, so small at first that it seemed almost negligible, would in time become a kind of widening fault line. But these fractures were still largely invisible from the outside, hidden beneath the gleaming surfaces of the new flagship stores and the growing roster of famous clients. To the watching world, Gucci in the 1950s and 60s was a story of triumphant ascendance, of a family business that had somehow managed to become a global brand while maintaining an aura of exclusivity and craftsmanship. The bamboo-handled bags were in the hands of movie stars. The loafer with its distinctive horsebit buckle was becoming a symbol of understated wealth, the kind of wealth that did not need to shout. But within the family itself, within the quiet councils where real decisions were made, something was beginning to fray. Perhaps this was inevitable. Perhaps any family enterprise, as it grows beyond a certain size, must eventually confront the tension between the personal and the institutional, between the values of its founders and the demands of growth. Or perhaps Aldo Gucci, for all his brilliance as a businessman, lacked the capacity to imagine a shared empire. His vision was his own, and increasingly, it was difficult for anyone else to fully inhabit it alongside him. The seeds of conflict had been planted, not in bitterness, but in the simple fact that expansion, growth, and the pursuit of global dominion create their own gravitational force, pulling family members in different directions whether they will it or not. And those gravitational forces, once set in motion, are almost impossible to reverse. While Aldo Gucci was building his vision of a global empire, his older brother Rodolfo had chosen a quieter path. Rodolfo, who had once pursued acting in Italian cinema under the stage name Maurizio d'Ancora, a romantic name befitting his artistic aspirations, had gradually withdrawn from the glare of ambition and settled into the quieter rhythms of family stewardship. He was the keeper of tradition, the guardian of the original Florence workshop's values, and he possessed a temperament so unlike his brother's relentless hunger that their differences seemed less like family variation and more like opposing philosophies made flesh. It was Rodolfo's son, also named Maurizio, born in 1948, who would eventually emerge as the unlikely bridge between these two worlds, and between the old guard and whatever future awaited the House of Gucci. But Maurizio's path to the family business was not carved out by ambition from childhood. Unlike his aggressive uncle Aldo, who had always lived and breathed leather and commerce, young Maurizio grew up sheltered in a very different kind of cocoon. His father Rodolfo had wanted something gentler for his only son, something that might protect him from the ruthless machinery of the fashion industry and the sharp elbows of his more ambitious relatives. Maurizio was educated abroad, sent away to boarding school in Switzerland, a place of manicured gardens and classical languages where the concerns of Florence's leather workshops must have seemed impossibly distant. There, surrounded by the sons of European nobility and industrialists, he absorbed a different kind of knowledge, not the knowledge of hide and stitching, but of art, philosophy, and the quieter disciplines of thought. When he returned to Italy to study at the University of Milan, he pursued law and economics, practical subjects that suggested perhaps his father was grooming him to understand business from its theoretical foundations rather than through worn hands and the smell of tanneries. Yet something in Maurizio's character, perhaps inherited from his father's artistic side, or perhaps emerging from the simple fact of being born into greatness without choosing it, created within him a peculiar hunger. It was not the hunger for dominance that animated his uncle. It was, instead, a quieter, more complicated yearning to belong to something vast, to prove himself worthy of a name that seemed to carry such weight, such history, such expectation. How often do the children of legacies feel this way, caught between gratitude for inheritance and the ache to earn their place through something of their own making? When Maurizio finally entered the Gucci business in his 20s, he did so not as a conqueror, but as a student. He had missed the foundational education that Aldo and his other cousins had absorbed through daily immersion. He had not grown up in the workshops. He did not know leather by touch before he knew it by name, and this absence of early formation created within him both a vulnerability and, perhaps, a capacity for vision that others had outgrown. It was during these early years of his gradual integration into the family business that Maurizio married. His wife was Patrizia Reggiani, a woman of considerable beauty and formidable will, born into a family of considerable wealth. Her father had made his fortune in the trucking business, and she carried with her an energy, an ambition, a kind of glamorous hunger that matched and perhaps even exceeded Maurizio's own quiet intensity. She was not content to be merely married to the Gucci name. She wanted to inhabit it, to possess it, to shape it. Whether Maurizio fully understood the nature of the force he had bound himself to remains a question history entertains but does not quite answer. The marriage itself became part of the Gucci story, not in the way that Aldo's ruthless dominance had shaped it, but in a more intimate, more ultimately destructive way. Patrizia brought with her an outsider's perspective, which is sometimes the most dangerous of all perspectives, because it sees clearly what those inside the machine have grown numb to. She saw the vast wealth that surrounded the Gucci name. She saw the global dominion that Aldo had assembled. And she saw, perhaps, in her sheltered, sensitive husband, both a means and a kind of blank slate upon which to inscribe her own ambitions. Yet Maurizio himself, in these early years, seemed genuinely devoted to the idea of restoring something that he sensed had been lost. As he moved deeper into the family councils and the business decisions, he began to understand what his more artistically inclined father had always known, that somewhere in the expansion, in the licensing, in the chase for market share across continents, Gucci had begun to lose the essential thing that made it matter. The brand, born from beeswax and care in a small Florence workshop, had become something more abstract. It had become a symbol that could be attached to almost anything. This awareness, this sensitivity to the erosion of the original thing, would become Maurizio's defining characteristic and perhaps his greatest vulnerability. Where Aldo saw only growth, Maurizio saw dilution. Where his uncle celebrated expansion, he quietly grieved what seemed like dissolution. And caught between a father who had largely retreated from the business and an uncle whose vision of empire had already solidified into immovable will, Maurizio found himself occupying an uncertain space. He possessed intelligence and education that neither his father nor his uncle had fully cultivated. He had access, through his marriage, to financial resources and social standing that might buffer him from complete subordination. Yet he lacked the decades of accumulated authority, the networks of loyalty, the hard-won reputation that his uncle commanded. He was a man trying to find his place within a machine that had already been largely designed by others, and the yearning he carried, the quiet, aching desire to matter, to be listened to reshape something according to his own understanding, would eventually become the hinge upon which the entire dynasty's fate would turn. In these quieter years of the 1960s and early 1970s, as Aldo Gucci continued to orchestrate his global expansion and Rodolfo maintained his protective distance, Maurizio was learning, he was absorbing, he was also, perhaps unknowingly, preparing himself for a collision with forces both within his family and, more consequentially, within himself. The sheltered boy who had been sent away to boarding school was becoming a man shaped by inheritance, education, marriage, and an increasingly clear-eyed vision of what the House of Gucci had been and what it was slowly ceasing to be. By the early 1970s, something remarkable and troubling was beginning to happen in the Gucci workshops and boardrooms alike. The family had tasted extraordinary success. Jackie Kennedy carried the bamboo-handled bag, Hollywood starlets requested their pieces by name, and wealth had flowed into Florence from across the Atlantic in ways that Guccio himself could never have imagined. But success, it seemed, had created a kind of appetite that could never quite be satisfied, and with that appetite came a decision that would begin, almost imperceptibly at first, to reshape what Gucci meant to the world. The licensing boom, as historians would later call it, was not unusual for its time. The 1970s saw many European luxury houses beginning to understand that their names, their logos, their design heritage could be worth something far beyond the products their own craftsmen could make. And so Gucci did what so many others were doing. The name began to appear on scarves, then on eyeglasses, then on watches, then on fragrances, then on luggage, on belts, on accessories of every conceivable type. Some of these were made by Gucci's own artisans, but many were not. Many were manufactured elsewhere, by other hands, in other workshops, often with materials chosen more for profit than for permanence. There is something almost hypnotic about watching a brand expand in this way, watching the logo begin to multiply, to spread like a vine across a garden wall, covering more and more surface. From a business perspective, it was brilliant. It was lucrative. It democratized luxury, in a way, bringing the Gucci name within reach of people who could never afford a leather trunk or a hand-stitched handbag. But there were artisans in Florence, some of them family, some of them craftspeople who had given their entire lives to the brand, who watched this expansion with a kind of quiet dread. Consider, for a moment, what happens when exclusivity itself becomes a commodity, when a name begins to mean something precisely because it appears so infrequently, so carefully chosen for each object it adorns, and then suddenly that name is everywhere, on every shelf, on every wrist, in every department store and airport terminal across the globe. What was once a signal of careful curation, of taste refined by years of attention to detail, slowly becomes simply a name, a logo, a thing one sees so often that its rarity, and therefore its power, begins to dissolve like sugar in water. Aldo Gucci, who had become the driving force behind the family's expansion into global markets, saw the licensing boom as the inevitable and beautiful consequence of success. He was a man of ambition, of vision, and he believed, perhaps with some justification, that putting the Gucci name on more products meant introducing more people to the Gucci standard, the Gucci way of thinking about quality and design. But there were whispers among the older craftspeople, among some of the family members who still remembered Guccio's original workshop, who believed something essential was being lost in the process. The bamboo bag, you might recall, had been born from necessity during wartime. The diamond print canvas had emerged from scarcity, from the ingenuity of artisans forced to improvise. These were objects that had meaning precisely because they represented a certain kind of problem-solving, a certain philosophy of making do beautifully, of finding grace within constraint. But when a luxury brand begins to proliferate, to license its name across hundreds of different products, the philosophy changes. Necessity gives way to excess. Constraint gives way to abundance. And abundance, paradoxically, can sometimes diminish value. By the mid-1970s, the Gucci logo had begun to appear on items that no craftsperson in Florence had touched. Scarves made in mills in India. Watches assembled in factories in Switzerland and Japan. Perfume manufactured by larger fragrance houses who simply paid for the right to use the name. Some of these items were undoubtedly beautiful, undoubtedly well made, but they carried the Gucci name without carrying the Gucci hand, and that distinction, though subtle, though perhaps difficult to articulate, began to matter more and more to certain people. There is a particular kind of unease that arises when you watch something you love become common. It is not quite snobbery, though it can resemble that. It is more a kind of existential discomfort, a sense that meaning is being diluted, that the story being told by an object is becoming confused, less coherent. When Gucci appeared only on carefully selected leather goods, the logo whispered something about the wearer. It suggested taste. It suggested knowledge. It suggested that this person had sought out something rare and valued it. But when Gucci appeared on every surface, in every context, it began instead to suggest something different. It suggested simply that one had money, or perhaps, more troublingly, that one was trying to appear as though one had money. Rodolfo Gucci, the third of Guccio's sons, was a man of conservative temperament. He had always preferred to focus on the core business, the leather goods that had built the family's reputation. He watched the licensing expansion with growing concern. There are accounts suggesting that he believed the family was selling not just their name, but their soul, trading the permanence of craftsmanship for the quick money of licensing deals. Whether this is entirely fair, or whether Rodolfo's concern was tinged with the conservatism of aging, is something we cannot quite know, but his reservations were not without foundation. The question that began to echo quietly through the 1970s was this: what does a brand become when it stops being scarce? when its name is no longer something you have to seek out, but something that is thrust upon you in every shop window, every magazine advertisement, every glossy catalogue. The answer, it would turn out, was complicated. The Gucci name did not lose its power, not immediately, but it did lose some quality of its meaning. It became less a marker of discernment and more simply a marker of aspiration, and that shift, subtle though it was, would begin to corrode the very foundation upon which the Gucci dynasty had been built. The licensing boom continued through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. It made money, enormous amounts of money. The family became wealthier still, but as the decade turned, as the 1980s emerged on the horizon, the internal tensions that had always existed within the Gucci family began to intensify. The family members began to disagree, more forcefully, more openly, about what Gucci should be. And those disagreements would eventually tear apart what 3 generations had built. By the early 1970s, Gucci had become something that would have seemed impossible to Guccio in his leather workshop all those years before, a name that belonged to the world, not merely to Florence. The leather goods hanging in boutiques from Manhattan to Milan carried the double G logo into airports and onto the shoulders of women who thought little of the hands that had stitched them. And yet, within the family that bore that name, a different kind of tension was beginning to gather, quiet at first, then audible, like storm clouds moving across an afternoon sky. Aldo Gucci, who had driven so much of this expansion with his restless energy and his gift for seeing markets where others saw only tradition, was now in his 60s. He had built something, and that accomplishment sat within him as both pride and an almost suffocating sense of possession. He had spent decades moving the company forward through force of will, through salesmanship, through an intuitive understanding of what wealthy people wanted before they knew themselves. His younger brother Rodolfo had retreated somewhat into the shadows, content to manage the Florence operations and to preserve a certain old-world standard that Aldo sometimes treated as an obstacle rather than an asset. And there was Maurizio, Rodolfo's son, still finding his footing in the business, still the quieter presence in family gatherings. But it was Paolo who would become the fissure through which all the accumulated pressure of the family finally began to escape. Paolo Gucci was Aldo's son, born into a world where his surname already carried weight and expectation. Unlike his father, who had clawed his way upward and earned his authority through decades of relentless work, Paolo had been handed a position within the family enterprise almost without question. And perhaps that was precisely the problem. He had talents, genuine creative instincts, an eye for color and form that suggested he might become a designer of real distinction. There was something artistic in him, something that looked backward to the original craftsmanship of Guccio, while also gazing toward what fashion might become. But his father saw design as secondary to the business of selling, and in a family where Aldo's voice had become nearly law, Paolo's creative impulses were consistently sidelined, questioned, overridden. Think of it from Paolo's perspective, if you will, to be born into legacy, to possess genuine skill, and yet to find that skill treated as something indulgent, something at odds with the real work of empire building. His father had opinions about everything Paolo wanted to try. The colors were too bold, the silhouettes were too experimental, the materials were impractical. Aldo had built Gucci into a global brand by understanding restraint, by preserving an image of quiet luxury and timeless elegance, and he could not fathom why his son wanted to push against those boundaries. By the mid-1970s, the tension between them had become almost physical in family meetings. Paolo would propose a direction, and Aldo would dismiss it with a quickness that suggested he was not truly listening. There were raised voices, moments of visible frustration that family members learned to recognize and dread. The rest of the family, aunts, cousins, younger brothers, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of witnesses to something that felt increasingly like not merely disagreement, but genuine rupture. What made it particularly combustible was that Paolo was not simply a disgruntled employee, he was an owner. He held shares in the company, inherited shares that represented his stake in what the family had built. He had a legal right to voice his opinions in boardroom discussions. Yet the family dynamics, the weight of Aldo's personality, and his decades of success seemed to render that legal standing almost irrelevant. Paolo's creative proposals kept surfacing, and they kept getting submerged beneath the gravity of his father's certainty. The pain of it, one imagines, went deeper than mere professional frustration. This was a father and son, locked in a family business where you cannot simply leave, where the blood tie and the business tie are indistinguishable. Paolo could not walk away from Gucci without walking away from his inheritance, his identity, his place in the family narrative. And Aldo, aging now, watching his life's work become a vast international operation, perhaps could not acknowledge that the future of Gucci might require voices different from his own. In the latter part of the 1970s, the tension began to spill beyond the closed rooms where family decisions were made. Paolo started speaking more openly about his frustrations, sometimes to journalists, sometimes to other family members. There was a quality of desperate pleading in some of these conversations, as though he were trying to make someone, anyone, understand that he had something to contribute, that his voice mattered. And Aldo, rather than softening, seemed to dig deeper into his resistance. Perhaps he interpreted Paolo's public complaints as betrayal. Perhaps he felt that any acknowledgement of his son's creative merit would be a kind of surrender, a tacit admission that the way forward was not his way. The law, as it often does, would eventually become the language through which this family anger was expressed, because other languages had failed. By the early 1980s, what had been simmering family conflict would begin to take the form of lawsuits, countersuits, and allegations that would drag the family's private wounds into the harsh light of courtrooms and newspapers. But that rupture did not happen suddenly. It was being constructed slowly, brick by brick, in hundreds of small moments of dismissal and misunderstanding, in a father's inability to see his son as anything other than an extension of his own will, in a son's increasingly desperate need to be recognized as something more than merely an heir. For now, though, the family still held together, at least on the surface. Gucci was still thriving. The stores still opened each morning. The leather was still cut and sewn. But beneath the polished counters and the gleaming displays, something irreplaceable was fracturing, and no one in the family quite knew how to repair it, or whether they truly wanted to. By the early 1980s, the Gucci family had accumulated not merely wealth, but the kind of deep, unresolved grievances that fester quietly for decades before erupting all at once. The workshops and boutiques that had once been the source of collective pride had become instead a space where ambition, ego, and creative frustration pressed against one another like opposing forces in a confined room. And it was Paolo, Aldo's restless son, whose frustrations would finally rupture the dam that had held back so much anger and resentment. Paolo had spent years in the design workshops, pushing for modernization, for bold new directions that he believed would inject vitality into the house of Gucci. His father, who had built an empire on refinement, restraint, and the power of understatement, saw Paolo's ambitions as reckless, garish, a betrayal of everything the brand represented. The tension between them was not the polite disagreement of colleagues, but something rawer, deeper. The friction between a father who could not see his son's vision and a son who felt perpetually diminished by his father's shadow. Does a son ever truly forgive his father for believing in him only half as much as he believes in himself? When the arguments moved from the design rooms to the executive offices, when decisions about Paolo's designs began to be blocked at the highest levels of the family hierarchy, something shifted in him. The resentment, which had been building like pressure behind a dam, found its outlet not in private reconciliation or family counsel, but in legal action. Paolo would eventually take his father to court, and in doing so, he would cross a line that perhaps no member of the Gucci family had truly believed could be crossed. A son does not easily turn against his father in a public forum, and yet here it was about to happen. The lawsuits that began in the early 1980s were complex, layered disputes about shareholding, about control of design decisions, about the very direction of the House of Gucci itself. But beneath the technical language of legal documents and the careful arguments of attorneys lay something far more intimate and painful: the assertion by Paolo that his father's management was not merely conservative or outdated, but actively harmful to the company. He would testify. He would speak in open court about his father's decisions, his father's blindness, his father's refusal to listen to him, and with each word spoken under oath, the private family struggle became public record. The American press, which had largely paid Gucci little mind beyond fashion reporting, suddenly found itself with a story that transcended business reporting. Here was a family dynasty, a name synonymous with elegance and taste, tearing itself apart from within. Here was a father and son, unable to resolve their differences in the privacy of boardrooms or family dinners, but instead airing their wounds before judges and journalists. The narrative was irresistible, not because it was salacious in any crude sense, but because it spoke to something universal about family, ambition, and the question of succession. What could be more dramatic than watching a great empire corroded from within by the very people who had built it? The American newspapers, particularly those in New York where Gucci's influence was most visible among the wealthy elite, began covering the story with increasing intensity. The trials became almost theatrical in their presentation, each new testimony adding another chapter to what was being framed as a family tragedy worthy of opera. Paolo's statements, Aldo's responses, the intervention of other family members trying to mediate or take sides, it all became material for public consumption. Readers who had never owned a Gucci bag found themselves invested in the outcome of disputes about shareholding percentages and design authority. The story had transcended the world of luxury goods and entered something closer to family drama, the kind that unfolds in courtrooms rather than over dinner tables. What was perhaps most jarring to the Gucci family themselves was the realization that their privacy had become not a right, but a luxury they could no longer afford. For decades, their internal disputes, their negotiations, their compromises and conflicts had remained largely within the family circle and the inner sanctum of the company's leadership. The outside world saw only the finished product, the elegant stores, the beautiful objects, the aura of refinement and exclusivity. But now, with Paolo's decision to seek legal recourse, every disagreement, every harsh word, every moment of family discord was being held up to scrutiny by strangers who had never met any of them, who saw only the dramatic outline of a family at war. The press coverage, while not always entirely sympathetic to any single party, did something that perhaps Paolo had not fully anticipated, and that certainly filled his father and other family members with something between anger and despair. It transformed the Gucci family from guardians of a brand into characters in a story, flawed, ambitious, sometimes petty, sometimes noble, but always compelling. The family's most private struggles, the conversations that should have remained behind closed doors, the disappointments that every family knows but keeps to itself, were being examined by the public gaze. And once that happened, once the family's wounds had been displayed before millions of readers in newspapers and magazines, the damage could never truly be undone. There was an irony, not lost on those who understood the family's history, in the fact that Paolo's attempt to assert his authority, to claim his place in the company's future, had instead contributed to a kind of unraveling that would eventually change the entire nature of the House of Gucci. The lawsuits that he initiated with the hope of winning control, of proving himself right and his father wrong, instead became the vehicle through which the family's internal machinery was exposed to public view. The scandals that followed, the legal battles that dragged on, the emotional toll on everyone involved, these were the costs of turning family conflict into legal warfare, of choosing the courtroom over the family council room. And yet, in another sense, perhaps there was inevitability in what was happening. A family business eventually reaches a point where it must either professionalize its governance or begin to splinter. The Gucci family had grown, had expanded, had accumulated not just wealth, but complicated relationships, competing visions, and fundamentally different ideas about what the House of Gucci should become. The pressures that had been building beneath the surface of their success were eventually going to rupture somewhere. Perhaps it was better that they did so early, even if the rupture took the form of public scandal and courtroom battles. Or perhaps not. Perhaps there was a path that had been missed, a moment of true listening and understanding that could have changed everything. But that moment, if it existed, was now firmly in the past. The year was 1986, and the empire that Guccio Gucci had built so carefully from a single leather workshop in Florence had grown into something almost unimaginable, a name recognized in the finest cities of the world, a symbol of a particular kind of luxury that whispered rather than shouted. Yet standing in a United States courtroom, Aldo Gucci, now in his 80s, faced something that no amount of horsebit buckles or bamboo handles could purchase his way out of. The charge was tax evasion, and it would mark the moment when the private struggles of the Gucci family became impossible to contain behind closed doors or marble-fronted boutiques. For decades, Aldo had operated as the public face of the House of Gucci, the charismatic salesman who had transformed his father's craft into a global business. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, to bending circumstances to his vision through charm, determination, and an almost instinctive understanding of what wealthy people desired. But the American tax authorities, it seemed, could not be charmed. They could not be convinced that certain income streams had simply slipped his notice, or that the complex web of international accounts and family transfers had simply been a matter of bureaucratic confusion. They had evidence, they had documents, they had patterns that stretched back years, suggesting a deliberate and sustained effort to conceal income from the Internal Revenue Service. What emerges from the records, and from the careful reconstruction by historians and business journalists in the decades since, is a portrait of a man caught between two worlds. On one hand, Aldo was a visionary businessman who understood, perhaps before anyone else in his family, that Gucci could become something more than a regional Italian luxury house. On the other hand, he was someone who had come of age in an era and culture where certain kinds of accounting were, if not precisely accepted, then at least winked at. The difference between what one reported and what one earned, this was a space where many powerful men operated. The post-war years in Italy had been wild, chaotic, full of improvisation and flexibility. Perhaps Aldo had never fully adjusted to the notion that in America the rules were different. Or perhaps he simply believed that a man of his stature and accomplishment should not have to adjust at all. The trial itself became, in many ways, a referendum on pride. Aldo's own son Paolo was among those who testified, and while the precise nature of what was said in that courtroom remains, in its intimate details, a matter of family privacy, the fact of that testimony itself, a son speaking against his father in a public proceeding, shattered something in the family's carefully maintained facade. Whatever tensions had been simmering, whatever resentments had been building in boardrooms and over dinner tables, they now spilled into the American press with a kind of sensational completeness that no amount of damage control could contain. The conviction came like a thunderclap on a clear day. 81-year-old Aldo Gucci was found guilty, and the sentence was imposed, a prison term, a man who had spent his life in the company of princes and Hollywood stars, who had cultivated an image of impeccable taste and refined sensibility, would now spend his remaining years, at least some portion of them, in federal custody. It was a fall that seemed almost incomprehensible to those who knew him, yet inevitable to those who understood the mathematics of such things. You cannot build an empire on generations of careful rule-following and then suddenly expect those rules to bend for you, no matter how much that empire is worth or how many people recognize your name. What strikes a thoughtful observer, sitting with this chapter of the story in the quiet hours before sleep, is the question of whether Aldo understood what he had risked. Did he ever look around at the buildings that bore his name, at the goods in the windows, at the women carrying his handbags down the streets of New York and Milan and Rome, and feel a genuine gratitude? Or had the acquisition, the growth, the steady accumulation of more boutiques, more markets, more influence, become so intoxicating that he had lost sight of something fundamental? The conviction and imprisonment did not destroy Gucci. The business continued, the name endured, but it marked a turning point, a moment when it became clear that the family at the heart of the dynasty was no longer operating as a unit, if it ever truly had been. There is a peculiar sadness in watching an aging man face the consequences of decades of decisions made in a particular spirit, a spirit of confidence, perhaps even of entitlement, a sense that the rules that governed ordinary commerce somehow did not apply to someone of his vision and accomplishment. Aldo Gucci had built something real and beautiful and lasting. The leather was still genuine, the craftsmanship still existed, the desire that his creations inspired in people around the world was authentic, and yet none of that stood against the simple fact that he had, by the determination of a court of law in a country whose market had become essential to his empire's growth, broken the rules that governed that country's citizens. In the years after his conviction, as Aldo served his time and emerged into a world that had continued turning without him, the House of Gucci itself continued its transformation. The next generation was already struggling for control, already making decisions that would reshape the entire trajectory of the brand. His imprisonment, it would turn out, was merely one moment in a longer story of dissolution and rebirth, of a family torn apart by ambition, by the weight of legacy, by the simple human difficulty of agreeing on what a thing should be. In the autumn of 1953, when Guccio Gucci's body was laid to rest in the Florentine cemetery, where generations of leather workers had already returned to the earth, something far more complicated than grief settled over the family he left behind. His will divided the company among his three sons, Aldo, Vasco, and Rodolfo, each receiving an equal share, as if leather goods could be divided as cleanly as an inheritance, as if three men with entirely different temperaments could somehow steer the same ship without collision. But time had a way of answering such unspoken questions, and the answer came not gently. Aldo, the eldest, possessed the hunger of a salesman born in the wrong century. He wanted nothing more than to see the Gucci name stretched across the globe, glittering in New York and Paris and Tokyo, each new boutique a small victory against obscurity. Vasco, the quieter brother, seemed content with the rhythms of production and tradition, and Rodolfo, the youngest, chose a different path altogether. He had moved to Rome in the years before their father's death, marrying an actress named Alessandra Moretti, and he possessed something that neither of his brothers seemed to fully grasp, a romantic notion of what the brand might become, a desire to protect its soul even as the world pressed in demanding its secrets. For decades, this uneasy partnership held. Aldo's ambition and Rodolfo's preservation somehow coexisted, creating a tension that, paradoxically, kept the company alive and vital. But families, like old leather, grow brittle over time. By the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the strains became visible to anyone who cared to look closely. Aldo was licensing the Gucci name to dozens of manufacturers, perfume, accessories, handbags that never touched a craftsman's hands in Florence. Each license agreement swelled the bank accounts but thinned the blood of the brand. Rodolfo watched this proliferation with the sadness of a man watching something precious being dispersed into the world in forms he barely recognized. And then, in January of 1975, Rodolfo Gucci died. He was 74 years old. The two remaining brothers, Aldo and Vasco, inherited his shares, and in this moment, the balance shifted irrevocably. But Rodolfo had left something behind that would prove far more consequential than his shares. He had left a son. Maurizio Gucci was born in 1948, the only child of Rodolfo and Alessandra. His life had been sheltered in ways that the children of founders and empire builders rarely are. Rodolfo, influenced by his wife's theatrical world and his own gentler sensibilities, had raised his son in Rome rather than Florence, surrounding him with art and culture rather than leather dust and account books. Maurizio grew up knowing he was a Gucci, knowing that his name carried weight in certain rooms, but he was kept somewhat apart from the machinery of the business itself. He attended university. He studied law and eventually commerce, preparing himself, perhaps, for a role he was not yet certain he wanted to play. When his father died, Maurizio inherited Rodolfo's share of the company, a significant stake, and one that suddenly made him, at 27 years old, a voting member of the family council. To Aldo, who had spent the previous 2 decades building Gucci into an international luxury house, this young man must have seemed like an intruder, untested and untried, arriving at a feast without having helped prepare the meal. And yet, Maurizio possessed something that ambition alone could not manufacture. He possessed a clarity about what had been lost in the pursuit of growth. He could see, from his somewhat outside vantage point, that Gucci had become a brand stretched so thin across so many products that its essence had begun to dissolve. The heady feeling of exclusivity that had once defined it, the sense that carrying a Gucci bag meant belonging to a particular world of refinement, had been diluted into something closer to ubiquity. There were Gucci scarves made in factories he had never seen. There were Gucci perfumes dispensed from department store counters. There were Gucci watches and belts and shoes, each licensed to manufacturers who answered to accountants rather than artisans. In the late 1970s, as Maurizio began to more actively involve himself in the business, he grew increasingly vocal about a troubling reality that the accountants seemed less eager to discuss. The company was spending more than it was earning. The debt was growing. The expansion had been exhilarating, yes, but beneath the surface, the foundation was cracking. Gucci was, in many ways, borrowing against its future, living on the reputation that Guccio and Rodolfo and even Aldo himself had earned, but not maintaining the actual value that gave that reputation substance. This troubled him deeply. Maurizio had been raised to believe in quality, in the integrity of the object, in the idea that a piece of leather could be a kind of promise, a promise that it would last, that it had been made by someone who cared whether it lasted. He looked around the Gucci empire in the late 1970s and early 1980s and saw something quite different. He saw a machine. He saw momentum without direction. He saw his uncle Aldo, now in his 70s, still conducting business with the fervor of a man racing against time, still convinced that more was always better, that the answer to every problem was expansion. Between them, the disagreement was not yet open warfare. It was something quieter and more insidious, a difference of vision so fundamental that compromise seemed nearly impossible. Aldo wanted Gucci to grow without limit. Maurizio wanted Gucci to survive by returning to its essence. Aldo had proven he could sell anything with the Gucci name attached. Maurizio had begun to suspect that the more they sold, the more they lost. The question that hung over the company, unspoken but ever present in the minds of those who watched it from a distance, was this: what happens when a family business is inherited by someone who questions the very foundation upon which his elders built their success? And perhaps more pressingly, in a family where blood ties run as deep and as complicated as they do in the House of Gucci, can such fundamental disagreements about the future ever be resolved through conversation alone? By the early 1990s, the Gucci family found themselves standing at a crossroads that would have seemed unimaginable to Guccio Gucci 70 years earlier, when he had first pressed his needle through leather in that small Florentine workshop. The empire they had built, the one that had survived war and fascism and internal combustion, now faced an enemy far more insidious than any external force: the sheer weight of its own debt and the exhaustion of a family no longer able to agree on anything. Maurizio Gucci, who had inherited control from his uncle Aldo, found himself increasingly isolated in boardrooms and in the marble halls of the company he loved. He had tried so earnestly to restore Gucci to the pristine reputation it had held in the 1960s, when the name itself had been whispered with reverence by those who understood the language of quiet luxury. But the years of licensing, the oversaturation of the market, the countless counterfeit bags flooding the streets of every major city, all of this had corroded the mystique. And now the numbers no longer worked. The company was bleeding money. The family, fractured beyond repair, could offer him no consensus, no unified vision, only silence. Only the expectation that he somehow succeed where they had all failed. It was in this climate of desperation and diminishing options that the talk began of bringing in an outside buyer. Not a competitor precisely, but an investor. A company called Investcorp, a Bahrain-based investment firm with interests across the luxury sector, began circling. The conversations were quiet at first, the kind of discussions that happened in private offices over coffee, that grew cold while men in suits spoke of valuations and market correction and the harsh mathematics of modern capitalism. The sale itself occurred in 1993. Investcorp purchased a controlling stake in Gucci, paying approximately $170 million for what had once been exclusively, irreplaceably, the Gucci family's inheritance. When the ink dried on those documents, something almost geological shifted. The company was no longer a family enterprise, it was an asset, a portfolio holding, a revenue stream to be managed and optimized. For Maurizio, the moment must have felt like watching a door close on a room he would never enter again. He remained as an executive, but his authority was now subject to the oversight of investment committees and quarterly earnings projections. The bamboo-handled bags, the meticulous stitching, the careful cultivation of desire among those who could afford it, all of this was now subordinate to the question that every corporation eventually asks itself: how do we grow? How do we increase our margins? The years that followed were uncertain and strange. Maurizio still occupied a position within the company's hierarchy, but his power was hollow. He had dreams, certainly. There were moments when he must have imagined that somehow, with enough work, enough clever design choices, enough strategic acumen, he could restore the family's fortunes and perhaps, one day, buy the company back. But these were the dreams of a man who no longer controlled his own fate. He was 56 years old. The weight of expectation, of legacy, of family history pressing down on his shoulders. It had become almost visible, the way it hunched him forward, the way it clouded his eyes in photographs from that era. Outside the boardrooms, Maurizio's personal life had become similarly complicated. His marriage to Patrizia had long since dissolved into an acrimonious separation. He had moved on to other relationships, but the spectre of that marriage lingered. Patrizia, who had once been so proud to be Mrs. Maurizio Gucci, now existed in a different relationship to him, one colored by resentment and the particular bitterness that can only arise between two people who once believed in each other entirely. In 1995, Maurizio Gucci stepped out of his office building on a spring morning in Milan. He had dressed carefully that day, as he always did. He lived a life of meticulous presentation, of maintaining standards even as everything else seemed to be slipping away. As he walked toward his car, 2 shots rang out in the quiet Milan street. He fell. Within moments, an era had ended. The last direct member of the founding family to hold control of the company was gone. The murder would dominate headlines for months. The details emerged slowly. The investigation, the suspicions, the eventual discovery that Patrizia, his ex-wife, may have orchestrated the killing. Some scholars suggest that a possible motive was rooted in a custody dispute over their daughter. Others point to the accumulated bitterness of a marriage that had curdled into something toxic. But underneath all the speculation and the trial testimony, there was a quieter truth. Maurizio Gucci had been a man caught between 2 worlds, unable to fully inhabit either one. He was too much a Gucci to ever escape the weight of the name, and yet not enough of a businessman to navigate the modern corporate machinery that had consumed his family's empire. With his death, any remaining possibility of the family reclaiming their own company evaporated. The bloodline's time at the helm had ended not with triumph, not even with dignity, but with violence, in a city street, a moment frozen in time that would define everything that came after. The morning of March 27th, 1995, began like any other spring morning in Milan. The sun moved slowly across the city's elegant facades. Maurizio Gucci, dressed in a dark overcoat and light scarf, entered the courtyard of his office building on Via Gaetano Previati. He had climbed these same steps hundreds of times. The rhythm of his footfalls on stone was a rhythm he no longer noticed. At 8:30 in the morning, as he reached for the heavy door, 2 shots rang out. The sound echoed off the stone walls. Within seconds, it was over. Maurizio Gucci lay on the pavement. The man who had briefly held his family's empire in his hands, who had once imagined restoring Gucci to its former glory, was gone. The leather goods that bore his name would outlast him. This is often the way with empires built on things rather than people. The world paused to ask the question that would consume the next years. Who had done this? The answer, when it came, was neither distant nor impersonal. It was intimate in a way that made the tragedy somehow heavier, weighted with the gravity of ordinary human emotion stretched to its breaking point. Patrizia Reggiani had married Maurizio Gucci in 1972, with genuine hope, the way one enters any marriage. She was 24 years old. Maurizio, quieter and more introspective than the brasher men in his family, had found in her a certain vitality, a presence that filled the silences of his carefully protected life. They had 2 children together. For a time, there was something like happiness, or at least the appearance of it. But marriages, like family businesses, can become machines of accumulation that grind down beneath the weight of what they're meant to preserve. The distance between them widened slowly, as distance often does, through small choices and smaller disappointments. When Maurizio fell in love with another woman, Paola Franchi, an interior designer with her own quiet elegance, it was not merely an affair, but a dissolution of what Patrizia believed was the foundation of her life. The separation began in 1991. Patrizia hired lawyers. The lawyers hired accountants. Maurizio's Gucci shares were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The legal battle became baroque in its complexity, each filing a small wound, each deposition another opportunity to recount grievance and claim. What had been love, or the memory of it, transformed into something else entirely. The court proceedings stretched on, month after month. Patrizia waited. She waited in the apartment they had shared, in the city they had shared, watching the man she had married recede into another life, into the arms of a woman she refused to acknowledge, except with the coldest kind of contempt. By the time the investigation into Maurizio's murder began, the detectives found themselves looking not outward into the world of crime and violence, but inward, into the chambers of a broken marriage, into the account books of divorce settlements, into the hearts of those who had lost the most. Patrizia had received a generous settlement, but it was not the empire. It was not her position as the wife of the owner of Gucci. It was money, which is never quite the same as meaning. The evidence, when it accumulated, was methodical rather than dramatic. Phone records. Witnesses who had seen her comportment change from despair to something else. A confession eventually would emerge, though the precise accounting of who had pulled the trigger, whether Patrizia had ordered it or merely spoken aloud a desire so profound it had somehow made its way into action, remained a matter of legal and moral interpretation. She had allegedly hired a man to commit the murder, according to prosecutors. The trial unfolded through 1996 and into 1997, and it became apparent to observers that this was not a story of passion and impulse, but of something slower and more considered. The grief of abandonment had curdled into something harder. What strikes the observer, looking back at this period with the kind of distance that time provides, is how small the human heart can make even the grandest affairs seem. Here was a woman whose husband controlled one of the world's most prestigious luxury houses, and yet what mattered most to her was not the company or the money or the legacy, but the fact of being left. The rejection itself became the central tragedy. The inability to bear that he had found happiness elsewhere, in the arms of someone else, in a life that did not include her. The trial itself was conducted with a certain restraint, as Italian legal proceedings often are. Patrizia Reggiani was convicted of orchestrating her husband's murder in November of 1997. She was sentenced to 29 years in prison. She would serve 18, released eventually on parole, and would spend her remaining decades moving through the world with the peculiar status of one who has committed an irreversible act and lived to see the consequences fully measured out. She gave interviews later, speaking always with a kind of detached curiosity about her own motivations, as though she were observing herself from a great distance. And what of the House of Gucci itself? This is perhaps the most poignant realization one comes to when studying the downfall of great families. The business did not fall because of the murder. The murder was not the cause of the empire's dissolution, but rather a symptom of a dissolution that had already begun long before. Maurizio's death meant only that the process accelerated. Within months, the Gucci family ceased to own their own company. The shares passed to InvestCorp, an international investment firm, and the bloodline that had maintained its stake for nearly 80 years was severed completely. The leather and thread would continue, the craftsmanship would endure. But the family, the human continuity that had shaped the brand since Guccio sat in his workshop in 1921, had finally relinquished its hold. One wonders, in the quieter hours, whether Patrizia Reggiani ever grasped this final irony. She had fought so fiercely to hold on to Maurizio, to preserve their marriage, to claim a portion of what he controlled. And in the act of taking him, in the moment of violence, she had ensured that she would lose everything. The Gucci empire that had absorbed so much of their lives, so much of their energy, so much of their capacity for love and trust, had slipped through both their hands. It had passed into the hands of distant investors who would see it purely as a thing to be managed, optimized, made profitable. The dynasty, in this sense, had ended not with grandeur, but with silence. Not with a decision or a proclamation, but with the slow closing of a door. What remained was the name, the logo, the legend. What had departed was the family itself, and the intimate knowledge that comes from generations of tending a craft, of standing in a workshop and understanding in one's bones the weight and purpose of what one's ancestors had built. In the years that followed the trial, as the courtrooms emptied and the photographers finally stepped back, Gucci the house stood at a peculiar threshold. The name was still there, embossed on handbags, stitched into loafers, whispered in the hushed galleries of department stores across the world. But something essential had shifted. The family blood that had animated the leather for nearly 70 years was no longer the current running through it. Maurizio was gone. Aldo had passed away in prison, a man diminished by the very empire he had built with such relentless hunger. The third generation, fractured and grieving, stepped away from the seat of power, and in that quiet moment of vacancy, something unexpected began to bloom. Tom Ford arrived at Gucci in 1994, just as the dynasty was collapsing, and he carried with him a different kind of vision. Not a restoration of what had been, but a kind of remembering, a careful excavation of Gucci's visual DNA without the weight of bloodline or obligation. He looked at the archive, at the photographs of handbags from the 1960s, at the interlocking G that Guccio himself had registered as a mark, and he asked the question that perhaps a family member could never quite ask: what if we began again? The transformation was gradual, almost reverent. The bamboo-handled bags were reimagined with a sensuality that honored their origins. The horsebit loafer, that quiet symbol of American wealth, returned to runways not as nostalgia, but as prophecy. The diamond print, born from wartime scarcity and hemp, you will remember, became something sacred again, woven into silks and leathers with a deliberation that whispered of the hands that first stitched it, generations before. What Ford seemed to understand, in a way that perhaps only someone outside the family could grasp, was that the true legacy of Gucci was never in the dominion or the empire itself. It was in the craftsman. It was in the small decision, made by an artisan in a workshop in 1921, to fold a piece of leather with precision. It was in the tanner who understood that quality demands time, that shortcuts produce counterfeit things. It was in the stitcher whose eyesight would eventually fail from the fineness of their work, but who would never accept a seam that was anything less than exact. Those people, the ones whose names appear nowhere in the histories of fashion, whose hands are not insured for millions, whose photographs do not grace any magazine, they were always the true keepers of the house. The rebirth under Ford, and later under Alessandro Michele, who would bring his own dreamlike precision to the house, was not a resurrection of the Gucci family dynasty. It was something perhaps more profound. It was the house learning to live without the family that had given it birth. The bamboo handles continued to be made. The leather continued to be tanned in Florence, in some cases by the descendants of workers who had tanned it 50 years before. The diamond print continued to carry within its weave the memory of wartime ingenuity and the refusal to compromise beauty even in scarcity. There is something deeply human in what happened after the trials ended, after the headlines faded. The name Gucci, which had become synonymous with family tragedy and courtroom drama, slowly returned to meaning something simpler, a standard of craftsmanship, a commitment to the leather, an acknowledgement that some things are worth the time they take to make properly. Museums began to acquire pieces from the archive. Retrospectives were organized. Scholars wrote about Guccio's vision in the context of Florentine design, rather than his descendants' legal tribulations. The story expanded beyond the drama of inheritance to include something quieter and more enduring. It became a story about how the idea, that small seed planted in Guccio's mind when he was a young man watching the luggage of the Savoy's guests, had contained within it not just the promise of luxury, but the persistence of beauty, made by human hands across generations. The leather continues to be treated with beeswax. The awl still pierces hides in Florence with the same sound it made a century ago. The workshops still smell of hide and wood oil, and the particular dust that rises from the work of making things by hand. And in those workshops, people continue to do something that requires no inheritance, demands no bloodline, and cannot be truly owned by anyone at all. They continue to make things of beauty, with precision, with care, with the quiet understanding that the work itself is the only legacy that matters. Perhaps that is what Gucci's fall and rise teaches us, in the end. Not that family empires are fragile, though they are. Not that wealth and power can corrupt, though they do. But rather that the truest things a family creates are often the things they create to be used, to be worn, to be touched by hands other than their own. The handbag carries the fingerprints of the woman who wore it, not the woman who owned the factory. The leather bears the marks of time and life, not of dynasty. The pattern woven into it was born from necessity, not ambition. As the leather softens with time and handling, as each bag acquires its own small history, separate from the grand narrative of the house, something true emerges. The Gucci dynasty ended not in triumph or in shame, but in transformation. The blood gave way to the hand, the family gave way to the craft. And perhaps, in the stillness of a well-made thing, we can finally understand that this was the only way it could have ever truly lasted. The leather remembers, the hands remember, and in the quiet hum of workshops in Florence, in the careful stitch of artisans whose names we do not know, the House of Gucci continues its work, as it always has, patient and precise, asking nothing of the world but the chance to make one more beautiful thing, one more, and then one more.